We're going to talk about pituitary development here today, and what I've drawn on the board is the beginning of an embryonic head. Here we have the brain outlined, and then the outside of the body is in blue. And right here where the surface comes around the front of the head and up into here, this little depression right in here is what we call the stomodium. And right here between the stomodium and the brain, this is the area we want to concentrate on when we're thinking about development of the pituitary gland. So, right in here in the roof of that stomodium, if we look at that going up in there, it develops a little pocket in there, right close to where the brain lies. So this would be this bulge. That'd be a magnified view of that right there. So right here, this is in the stomodium. This is all stomodium. Coming in right here, we have it coming up close to the floor of the brain. So the floor of the brain is right along here. This part of the brain right here where this comes up and meets, this will become the hypothalamus of the brain. So here's your hypothalamus. And this little pocket right here that forms off the roof of the stomodium is known as Rathke's pocket. Now we're going to look at what happens here between Rathke's pocket and the hypothalamus of the brain, right here where that brain is curled under. Now this is a little odd because we're kind of drawing it upside down because that's the way we drew the original embryo picture there, but once again, here's Rathke's pocket. It's going to be forming more of an invagination right there, and this is all stomodium out here. Rathke's pocket right there, and the floor of the brain comes along here. It's going to meet up with that and form a little downgrowth right there next to Rathke's pocket from the hypothalamus right here. The next thing that happens, let me erase some of this and just draw the next picture below it here. So next we get this little invagination, that Rathke's pocket, to form a separate vesicle in here. It separates from that epithelial lining of the outside of the body. And that part of the brain that comes up here forms more of a structure, a lobe that comes down behind that little bubble right there. So I'm going to twist this now and turn the head upright like our head would be, and we're going to look at that again and look at what happens between the Rathke's pocket structure that formed and this downgrowth from the hypothalamus of the brain. So there's the apart from our hypothalamus. This is going to become our posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will be derived from Rathke's pocket. And now this structure will come up here and kind of wrap around that stalk and then extend out this direction. Inside there's a cavity that develops right in here. Actually, the cavity was already there as part of that pocket. So when this first forms, it has this kind of a shape. It's like a balloon being pushed up around a post here in the back. So this is anterior pituitary, this is posterior pituitary. Eventually the tissues in here will proliferate in the anterior pituitary, and this cavity will be reduced to a few little vesicles or cysts out around here. So this kind of forms a little region of little pockets or cysts. They're sometimes referred to as colloidal cysts in there. We'll try to identify a few things now. This part of the pituitary that comes down from the brain, this forms the stalk connection right here, is known as the infundibulum. And this end down here is referred to as the pars nervosa. Pars nervosa. That means the part that's derived from the nervous system. The anterior part here includes a part that forms essentially a tube around the infundibulum. It's referred to as the pars tuberalis. The section out here to the front is referred to as the pars distalis. And up here, close to where these colloidal structures form, right through here, this is referred to as pars intermedia. Pars intermedia, the intermediate portion. Okay, here we have anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary with pars distalis down here, pars intermedia in through here, and then behind the vesicles, the colloidal vesicles, pars tuberalis back in the toward the posterior side of things. So this is front, this is back. Another name for the anterior pituitary is adenohypophysis. The adenohypophysis. Same thing as anterior pituitary. In this region, especially in the pars distalis here, we see three different cell types according to the stain that they associate with. When you prepare a section with both basic and acid stains, the basophilic cells show up separate from acidophilic cells, and then there's a group that don't associate with either the acid or the base stain. They refer to those as chromophobes. Chromophobes. So the basophilic cells, they're not just one kind of cell. Some of these cells will be producing adrenocorticotropic hormone. Some will be producing a follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. Those what we call gonadotropes. And some of them will be producing thyroid stimulating hormone. Anyway, those are common things produced by the basophilic cells. The acidophilic cells produce some somatostatin. Remember, that was also produced in pancreas. And prolactin, having to do with milk production. Prolactin is produced by the acidophilic cells. Not really sure what might be produced by chromophobes, whether they might have some of those same functionalities, but to a lesser degree, it's not really known. So anyway, we have these clumps and strands of these cells all through here. And along with those clumps and strands, we have some capillaries. So I drew a capillary in over on this side. The green represents collagen fibers. So there are little bits of, well, it's primarily reticular fibers, I guess. But reticular fibers, some form of collagen in there, and cells that would be producing that, the reticular and fibroblast cells. And then I put in here in black some special cells that are found in the anterior pituitary right here, called folliculostellate cells. And their functionality is not completely known. What exactly they do, we're not sure. But anyway, they're interspersed in through there, along with these other cell types. Now, as you move from the pars distalis here up toward the pars intermedia, we lose the acidophils and we still have basophils and chromophobes up in this region. And these little colloidal cysts are lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. Colloidal cysts. So those are the things you find in the anterior pituitary. All of these are hormone producing tissues. There's a blood supply coming to it. There's a good blood supply, small capillaries going all through there to carry those hormones away from the pituitary to their target organ. Now for the posterior pituitary. Remember, this is hypothalamus of the brain up here, and this club-like extension hangs down. Your anterior pituitary would fit right up here against this tubular portion, or this stalk-like portion, I should say, right here, and form a tube around it, that pars tuberalis. So this is all the posterior pituitary. This up here is referred to as the infundibulum, the stalk that connects, and this down here is referred to as the pars nervosa. Now, what's inside here? The primary component within this, there are cells up here at the top of this stalk in the hypothalamus of the brain that have nerve fibers that extend all the way down to the far end of the posterior pituitary. So we have these long fibers, nerve fibers that come from these neurons up here. There's another cluster somewhere over here, and they have their fibers come down here as well. These produce hormones, these cells up here, that are transferred down the nerve fiber and then released from nerve endings down here at the lower end of the posterior pituitary. Two primary hormones here are ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So in the posterior pituitary, the main thing you see are just nerve fibers. Along those nerve fibers, it's common to see swellings along their length where there's an accumulation of fluids that makes that structure swell. These are referred to as herring bodies. There is a blood supply. There will be capillaries in there. And there's another cell type in there. It's very abundant. Small cell is considered a neuroglial cell. They're all through here, and these are called pituocytes. Pituocytes, they're just pituitary cells. Pituocytes, pituitary cells in there as well. So you've got capillaries, you've got herring bodies and nerve fibers, and pituocytes makes up all the structure of the posterior pituitary gland. And the hormones that are released are actually produced up here in the hypothalamus, and they travel down through those nerve fibers to the end and are released into the bloodstream there at the end of the posterior pituitary. So we've got two different kinds of structures that release different kinds of chemicals, and they do it in different ways. In this drawing, we have the brain structure here, and right here I've tried to indicate the location of that pituitary gland again. So that would be the location of the pituitary. This would be hypothalamus right about here. I'll put my X right there. That's the thalamus region of the brain, where it's kind of a connection between the sides and surrounding that kind of donut shape. That's the third ventricle, the fluid-filled space. It's kind of flat and narrow side to side, but then has that circular shape in there between the halves of the brain. Toward the back of all this in here, there's a small structure that develops that we know as the pineal gland. It produces melatonin, which we know is vital to our sleep-wake cycle. So that's where that comes from. The tissues in the pineal gland, this is a part of the brain and it develops out of brain tissue. The pineal gland has a very small cell in it we call a pineal oocyte. So we have a bunch of little pineal oocytes. Make up most of the tissue, very small cells. Mixed in there, there's a kind of glial cell that's, they say, is similar to the small cells in the posterior pituitary we just looked at, the pituocytes. But anyway, a small glial cell form that's kind of mixed in with some of that. And of course there will be capillaries going through there, so there's a blood supply, so you'll have blood vessels penetrating through these tissues as well. In addition to the two cell types and the blood vessels in the pineal gland, there is the presence of another material, small solid particles in there. They go by the name corpora arenacea. I think that's spelled right there. Anyway, another name for that, common name for that, is what we call brain sand. Brain sand, small solid particles in there. So, pineal oocytes, and we'll just call them glial cells. Sometimes they're called interstitial glial cells, and capillaries that will carry that melatonin. So that's our pineal gland. It's called pineal because it's kind of shaped like a little pine cone structure. That's where it gets its, the origin of the name is kind of a pine cone shaped structure. The thyroid gland is kind of this H-shaped gland. It would sit right below your Adam's apple, right below the larynx, right there. The trachea would be extending down in here. Your clavicles would be about right in here, above your collarbone, so kind of right in front of your windpipe, there and on either side. So in this tissue there are what we call thyroid follicles. And the thyroid follicle, we've seen those before. They're simple cuboidal epithelium all around the thyroid gland follicles here. So there'd be just numerous follicles, so basically the same shape, rounded structure, some of them smaller, some of them larger. But anyway, these are thyroid follicles, and the cells that you find in there are thyroid follicle cells. There's an additional cell type that works itself in between these thyroid follicles in here. I'm going to draw just a few of them in here in this blue color. These are calcitonin producing cells, sometimes called parafollicular cells. Parafollicular means just next to the follicle. Calcitonin producing cells. Calcitonin cells or calcitonin producing cells. We'll talk more about calcitonin here in a minute when we talk about the parathyroid gland. Other than that, Other than the thyroid follicle cells and parafollicular cells, everything else is pretty common tissue. There's some loose connective tissue in between the follicles and around these parafollicular cells, and of course there would be capillaries that would carry the hormones of the thyroid in there as well. But that's the simple structure of thyroid tissue. Next, parathyroid tissue. On the back side of the thyroid gland in here, there are going to be typically 4 masses of tissue we call parathyroid tissue, parathyroid gland. It's divided into 4 parts here. So in those tissues, in the parathyroid tissues, there are 2 cell types. There's a small cell type that produces the parathyroid hormone. These are called principal cells. Principal cells. Small dark staining, they stain well with the basophilic stains. And then there's another cell type that is not basophilic. And these are a little bit larger cells. These are called oxyphil cells. And you'll find these different clumps of both types of cells, both the principal cells and the oxyphil cells, and mixed into that parathyroid gland. We're not sure of any role for the oxyphil cells, but the principal cell produces parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are 2 hormones that work opposite one another, similar to the way that insulin and glucagon work to regulate blood sugar. These work to regulate mainly blood calcium. They also affect phosphate salts that are released from your bone as well. So parathyroid hormone will increase your circulating blood calcium. It will bring more from your gut or from your bone tissue, so it will affect release of calcium from the bone. And then calcitonin will increase the deposition and removal from the blood in there. So those are counteracting hormones. Parathyroid increases calcium, calcitonin decreases calcium in the circulating blood. In addition to these 2 cell types, there will be bits of connective tissue and blood vessels worked into the parathyroid gland. Oh, thyroid follicle cells, don't forget about this. These produce thyroid hormone, helps to regulate your overall metabolic rate. Most people are aware of that. Next, we're going to look at the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sits atop the kidney. So the kidney would be like right here, big old kidney down below, and a fairly small adrenal gland up above the kidney, a little cap on the kidney up there. The adrenal gland has a central region referred to as the medulla. The cells of the medulla are very different than those that form the cortex region out around here. So we have adrenal cortex hormones or chemicals, and we have adrenal medulla chemicals in here. The adrenal medulla has a kind of cells that we call chromaffin cells. They produce both epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those cells can be stimulated by your autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight system, your sympathetic nerve fibers reach into the medulla of your adrenal gland, and when they stimulate those cells, they release those chemicals, epinephrine and norepinephrine, into the bloodstream. So that increase in those hormones, those chemicals, in response to some kind of strong stimulus of fear, anger, that kind of thing in the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex cells are completely different. They have different roles. We kind of divide that adrenal cortex into 3 zones. I have a dotted line for one of them here, but then there's another. These are all kind of connected. There are clumps and strands of cells of similar appearance going all through here. In the outer part here, we call this outer part the zona glomerulosa. Zona glomerulosa, because the cells kind of form globular groups, and this particular region produces aldosterone, which we learned about when we talked about the renin-angiotensin pathway. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal gland, and it causes retention of water in the kidney. The next zone in here, the second zone, zona fasciculata, has more straight-like tubes, not tubes, but clumps of cells that kind of go longitudinally between the outer zona glomerulosa and the inner zona reticularis. In the reticularis, reticular means like a network, like interbranching strands of cells in that zone there. The zona fasciculata produces what we often think of as adrenal corticoid, cortical chemicals, cortisols, glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids would be the right thing there. Let me write that up here. Glucocorticoids, and then the zona reticularis produces some androgens in there. It also produces some more glucocorticoids, like the zona fasciculata. So we have aldosterone, glucocorticoids, and androgens all being produced by that adrenal cortex zone, and the medulla is responsible for epinephrine and norepinephrine release in the fight or flight response.